3 weeks after we brought home a silent little boy, I caught my mother-in-law talking to him in a language I didn't know she spoke. He answered her, without opening his mouth. I thought the weirdest part would be the words. I was wrong. I never pictured myself writing one of these. I'm 28F, married to Daniel, 32M, and 3 weeks ago we took in a boy from a local orphanage. I'm calling him Luke, he's 6. The file said selective mutism. He doesn't speak, but he's bright and affectionate in small bursts, like a cat who chooses you as furniture and then remembers to purr. He sleeps with his sneakers by the bed, ready to run, like a kid who learned early that nothing good waits. Daniel had wanted to adopt for a long time. He has this hero complex that used to feel like a warm coat in winter, big, soft, and smelling like cedar. When we met, he was the guy who stopped traffic to help a kitten across the road. People swooned. I swooned. We married fast. The first time I saw Luke, he was folding paper boats for the other kids and pushing them across a plastic tub of water. He didn't look up when I said hello. He didn't look up when Daniel crouched down and said, "Buddy, want to see our car? It's blue." He just kept pushing the little paper ships, eyes fixed on a point I couldn't see. But when I sat beside him and folded a terrible boat of my own, he slid it back to me so gently you'd think it was made of glass. I cried in the parking lot because my heart had never met anything so cautious and kind. We baby-proofed. We learned the signs the orphanage speech therapist recommended: please, thank you, more, hurt. We put sticky notes on drawers with pictures, spoon, socks, toothpaste. He drew dinosaurs with meticulous spikes and handed them to me, like contracts. No words, but the meaning was there: I exist. Don't forget me. Daniel's mom, Margaret, showed up at our door with casseroles and a crocheted blanket that looked like an ocean. She's one of those women who smell like expensive soap and have opinions about everything. We don't have the easiest history. She thinks I'm overly sensitive, which is her way of saying, not my daughter. But when she tucked the blanket around Luke and whispered me cielo in this absent-minded way, like a song she couldn't stop humming, I thought it sounded like a nickname from a soap opera. She brushed it off, just something I picked up when I traveled years ago. Everyone says new parenthood is a fog. Adopting felt like walking inside that fog while carrying a crystal vase. The first week, Luke followed me everywhere, even into the bathroom, his small hand curled in the hem of my sweater. The second week, Luke's curiosity about our house grew like ivy, slow, deliberate, and impossible to stop. By the second week, he had memorized every creak in the hallway, figured out which floorboards were the loudest, and discovered that if you pushed the living room window just so, it rattled like a coin in a jar. Still no spoken words, but sometimes, usually in the late afternoon, he'd pull out the small whiteboard we kept near the coffee table and write single words in careful block letters: dog, son, mom. Sometimes they were answers to questions I'd asked hours before. Other times, they felt like unprompted little offerings, a breadcrumb trail into his mind. When Daniel's workload at the firm doubled and I took on a new client at the agency, we realized we couldn't be home in the afternoons. The daycare waitlist was still months away from moving, so we had to find someone we trusted to bridge those hours. Margaret was the obvious choice. She had the time, she lived only 10 minutes away, and Daniel seemed certain it would help her bond with him. I hesitated. Margaret and I had never been close. She had a way of smiling that felt like she was holding back an unflattering comment. With Luke, she had been polite, brought over soup, asked about his appetite, but I couldn't tell if she genuinely cared for him or was simply checking a box. Still, when I asked if she'd be willing to help, she agreed instantly. Too instantly. There was no pause, no "let me check my schedule." Just, "Of course, dear. I'd love to." On her first day, I gave her the basics: snack options in the fridge, the reward chart for trying new sounds, a gold star for a whisper, 2 for a hum, and a reminder to text me if she needed anything. I had already set up our old tablet as a nanny cam in the living room, not because I didn't trust her, I told myself, but because it was habit. The first 2 afternoons were uneventful. I checked the feed during my lunch breaks and saw Luke stacking Legos on the rug while Margaret sat nearby flipping through a magazine. He didn't look especially engaged, but nothing seemed off. Then came the third day. I was midway through preparing a presentation when my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I glanced at it, expecting to see Luke wandering toward the kitchen. But the live feed made me pause. Margaret sat cross-legged on the rug, facing Luke directly. He was on the crocheted blanket she'd given him, surrounded by the stuffed dinosaurs he adored. Her body was angled forward in a way I'd never seen before, focused, intent. At first, the sound was muted. My finger hovered for a moment before I tapped to unmute. What came through the speaker stopped me cold. She wasn't speaking English. Her voice rolled in a warm, rhythmic cadence, each syllable fluid and deliberate. It took a second to place it, but there was no mistaking it, Spanish. Luke's head tilted slightly. His eyes sharpened with a recognition I'd never seen before. He didn't speak, he never did, but his small hand reached for the whiteboard. Quickly, he began to write. Margaret's lips curved faintly, and she spoke again, her tone soft but purposeful. He erased the board and wrote again, faster this time. I pinched the screen to zoom in. The letters weren't the blocky English I'd grown used to. They were slanted, connected in places. One word was clear enough for me to make out, see. I felt a strange tightening in my chest. Maybe he'd picked up a few Spanish words at the orphanage, I told myself. Kids absorb things. Maybe Margaret was just testing his recognition. But as I kept watching, I noticed his posture, the way his shoulders relaxed, the subtle lean toward her. It wasn't the posture of a child deciphering an unfamiliar language. It was the posture of someone listening to words that felt like home. I didn't tell Daniel that night. I didn't want to sound paranoid or make something out of nothing. But after Luke went to bed, I replayed the clip 3 times. Each time, that knot in my stomach pulled tighter. 2 days later, I caught them again. Same setup, Margaret leaning in, Luke writing fast, both of them locked in an exchange I couldn't quite hear clearly. But this time, there was something else in her face. Not grandmotherly affection. Not idle curiosity. It was the expression of someone passing on a secret. And my silent boy was hanging on every word. By the 4th afternoon of Margaret's babysitting, I was no longer casually checking the nanny cam. I was watching it like a hawk, muted at first, then unmuted, the volume turned low so no one in the office could overhear. Each time, it was the same pattern. She'd wait until Luke was settled on the blanket, pull her chair closer, and switch into Spanish like flipping a light. He'd listen, nod faintly, and write his answers in that same slanted hand. It wasn't just the language. It was the way she looked at him, sharp, assessing, almost familiar. Like she knew him in a way no one else did. I started thinking about the little details I'd brushed off before. The way she'd called him mi cielo the day she brought the blanket. The fact that she'd agreed to babysit without a second thought. The way Luke, who barely tolerated strangers, let her smooth his hair without flinching. That night, I mentioned it to Daniel, carefully, casually, like it wasn't eating me alive. Your mom speaks Spanish? I asked over dinner. He shrugged, cutting into his chicken. I think she picked some up when she lived abroad after college. Why? She and Luke, they talk. Well, she talks, and he writes back. In Spanish. Daniel didn't even look up. Huh. That's good, right? Means he's communicating. It's more than that, I pressed. He understands her. Like fluently. He speared another bite, clearly uninterested. Maybe he's just a fast learner. You're reading too much into it. That dismissal made something inside me click. I realized I was on my own in figuring this out. The next day, I pretended to leave for work but circled back, parking a street over. I sat in my car, logged into the feed, and watched the entire afternoon unfold from my phone. Margaret wasn't just speaking Spanish. She was asking questions, direct, probing. I caught fragments when Luke's whiteboard faced the camera. Donde estabas antes? Where were you before? Quien más sabe? Who else knows? These weren't the kinds of phrases you use to teach a child colors or numbers. I screenshotted everything. The timestamps, the clearest frames of the words he wrote, the way her mouth shaped the questions. That night, after Luke was asleep, I opened my laptop and started digging. I searched Margaret's name along with residency abroad, Spain, Mexico, Argentina. I found an old local newspaper snippet about her volunteering overseas, but the details were vague. Too vague. By midnight, I had made my decision. If Margaret was hiding something, I needed someone who could dig deeper than a Google search. Someone who knew how to follow a paper trail I couldn't. I emailed a private investigator. The PI called me 2 days after I sent the email. His voice was brisk, the kind of tone people use when they already know you're not going to like what they found. Margaret Cole, he began, spent more than 15 years living outside the U.S. Not just traveling, full residency. Most of it in South America, with extended stays in Spain. She came back about 5 years ago. That was longer than Daniel had ever made it sound. He always spoke of it like a short adventure before she settled down to be closer to family. I asked the PI for details, addresses, employment history, anything. He hesitated, then said, she was involved with extended relatives overseas. A lot of the paperwork connects to a family estate, something about inheritance disputes. I'll need more time to piece it together. Inheritance? That word clung to me like burrs. What possible link could that have to Luke? That night, I sat across from Daniel at dinner and watched him the way I'd been watching his mother on the nanny cam. I tried to imagine his reaction if I told him I'd hired a PI. Would he be angry? Defensive? Or would he act exactly like he did when I first mentioned the Spanish, disinterested, like it wasn't worth worrying about? Over the next week, Margaret's sessions with Luke grew longer. The camera caught her leaning in so close their foreheads nearly touched. She'd gesture with her hands, drawing shapes in the air, and Luke would write, erase, write again. Always in Spanish. I'd take screenshots, cataloging every phrase I could partially make out. Then, one Thursday afternoon, the PI called again. This time, his voice was slower, heavier. I think you need to prepare yourself, he said. Your husband isn't who you think he is either. The air in my office felt suddenly thin. What are you talking about? I've been following financial leads from your mother-in-law's time abroad. While doing that, I ran a cross-check on your husband's accounts. He's been renting an apartment in another part of town under a secondary bank account. My mouth went dry. Why? He didn't draw it out. Because his girlfriend lives there. She's 7 months pregnant. I couldn't speak. For a moment, all I heard was the faint hum of my office computer and the PI's breathing on the line. Do you want me to keep digging? He asked quietly. Yes, I managed. And find out how my mother-in-law fits into all of this. I don't care how deep you have to go. When I hung up, I sat staring at the nanny cam feed on my phone. Margaret was smiling at Luke, her hands resting on his small shoulders, speaking low and steady. Luke looked up at her with complete trust. I suddenly realized, I might be the only person in this house who didn't know the truth. The PI didn't call for 4 days, and in that time, every minute in my house felt wrong. I'd catch Daniel staring at his phone a little too long. Margaret kept texting to confirm pickup times, even though the schedule hadn't changed. And Luke. Luke had started drawing things that made my skin crawl. One afternoon, I found a sheet of paper on the coffee table covered in neat little sketches, a sprawling house with iron gates, palm trees swaying in the background, a man in a suit standing by the door. Next to it, another drawing, a stick figure boy holding hands with an older woman. The woman had Margaret's hairstyle down to the last wave. I didn't ask him about it. Instead, I photographed it and emailed it to the PI. The subject line was just, "Does this mean anything?" He replied the next morning. "Yes. I'll explain when I call." When the phone finally rang that night, I locked myself in the bathroom. "I have your answer," he said without preamble. "Luke isn't just some random child from the orphanage. He's your mother-in-law's cousin's son." I blinked, trying to make the math work. "That would make him a cousin to your husband," the PI finished. "From what I've uncovered, there's a substantial inheritance in play. Luke's father, Margaret's cousin, passed away last year. The estate is tied up in legal requirements, and one of them is that Luke must be under the care of a family member to claim it when he comes of age." My mouth felt dry. "So you're telling me she pushed for us to adopt him, for money?" "That's what it looks like," he said. "Margaret has been his legal guardian on paper since his father died, but placing him with you and Daniel satisfies the court's conditions while keeping him in her orbit." I sank onto the edge of the tub. "And Daniel knew?" "I can't prove it yet," he admitted. "But given his financial activity and the timing of the adoption paperwork, I'd bet he's in on it." I ended the call and just sat there, the cool porcelain against my legs. Outside the door, I could hear Luke humming faintly, something he'd never done before. It was soft, almost tuneful, like the echo of a lullaby. Margaret's voice followed a moment later, speaking in that same slow Spanish I'd memorized from the camera footage. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the tone. It was the tone of someone closing a deal. And suddenly, I realized this wasn't just about betrayal. This was about being surrounded by people who were all playing the same game, and I was the only one who hadn't been told the rules. I didn't sleep the night I learned the truth about Luke. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind looping over the PI's words. Cousin. Inheritance. Legal guardian. All the while, Daniel's breathing beside me was slow and even, like nothing in his world had shifted. By morning, I had rehearsed a dozen ways to confront him. Some involved throwing the evidence in his face. Others, less civil. In the end, I decided to start small, test his reactions before detonating the bigger truth. "Can we talk about Luke?" I asked over breakfast. Daniel didn't look up from his coffee. "What about him?" "I've been doing some reading," I said carefully. "About his background. His file at the orphanage was incomplete." His spoon clinked against the mug. "Incomplete how?" "Like it skipped over the part where he's your cousin." That got him. His head jerked up, eyes sharp. For a second, I saw calculation in them, then it was gone. "Where did you get that idea?" he asked, voice too casual. "I hired someone," I said. "A private investigator." The silence that followed was heavy enough to hear the hum of the fridge. "You had no right," he said finally, his jaw tightening. "I had every right," I snapped. "You lied to me about who he is. And don't pretend you didn't know. Your mother's been speaking to him in Spanish since day one." Daniel set his mug down slowly. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" My voice cracked. "You and your mother used me to make this adoption legal so you could get your hands on some inheritance money." For a moment, I thought he might deny it. Instead, he sighed, as if I'd just caught him hiding a surprise party. "It's not like that," he said. "The money will help everyone. We could pay off the house, save for college, travel. I laughed, bitter and sharp. "You mean to the apartment you keep for your pregnant girlfriend?" The color drained from his face. That was confirmation enough. "I don't know what you think you know. I know everything," I cut in. "She's 7 months along. I know you've been paying for that place with a separate account. I know exactly who you are now." He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping the tile. "This is exactly why I didn't tell you. You blow things out of proportion. You've been lying to me since the day we met Luke," I said. "And probably long before that." For a moment, we just stared at each other. His expression wasn't guilt, it was irritation, like I'd spoiled his carefully balanced arrangement. I walked away before I could see it turn into something worse. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't over. People like Daniel didn't just give up when they were caught. And I still had Margaret to deal with. After the confrontation, the house felt like a pressure cooker. Daniel went quiet, not the sulking kind, but the calculating kind. The kind where you know someone's mind is working overtime, but you can't tell if they're planning an apology or an ambush. Margaret's presence seemed to grow, even when she wasn't there. Every time the front door opened, I half expected her to walk in with that expensive soap smell and her calm, knowing smile. Luke was the only one who acted the same, but now I was seeing things I hadn't noticed before, how he would pause before answering Margaret's questions, as if weighing whether to tell her the whole truth or just enough to satisfy her. How his drawings sometimes included details no 6-year-old should remember, like the engraved crest above a set of iron gates or a string of numbers in neat, deliberate handwriting. I didn't tell him what I knew. How could I? He was already living in a house full of secrets. But I started thinking about ways to shield him, in case Daniel and Margaret decided their plan would be easier without me in the picture. The first thing I did was copy every single piece of footage from the nanny cam to an external drive I kept at work. The sessions in Spanish, the phrases on the whiteboard, even the one where she put her hand over his and guided him to write something I couldn't quite make out, I kept it all. Then I called the PI again. If something happens to me, I told him, you make sure the authorities see everything. All of it. And you make sure Luke is safe. He didn't question me. Just said, understood. At night, I pretended to sleep while Daniel scrolled through his phone, the glow lighting his face in that same detached way. My phone was hidden under my pillow, recording everything. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was often on the balcony in hushed tones. I caught bits, timing, papers, won't be an issue. Always vague, always just out of reach. I started walking Luke to the park after work, just the two of us. I'd push him on the swings and talk out loud about the most ordinary things. What I made for lunch, the weather, the pigeons stealing crumbs from a toddler's snack. I wanted him to hear my voice without any pressure to answer, to remember there was at least one person in his orbit who didn't demand anything from him. One evening, while we were sitting on a bench watching the sunset, he pulled the whiteboard from his backpack and wrote in perfect, deliberate Spanish, "Puedo confiar en ti?" Can I trust you? I didn't speak Spanish fluently, but I knew enough to answer. Yes, I said, my throat tight. Always. For the first time, he looked straight into my eyes and gave the smallest nod. And that was when I knew, whatever Margaret and Daniel were planning, I was now part of Luke's plan too. The clash with Margaret happened sooner than I expected. It was a Sunday afternoon, warm enough that the smell of cut grass drifted through the open windows. Daniel had left early, to run errands, which I suspected meant he was visiting her, or worse, his mistress. Luke and I were in the living room building a Lego city when the doorbell rang. I half expected a neighbor. Instead, it was Margaret, standing there in a cream blouse, her hair perfectly in place, holding a paper bag of pastries like she was just dropping in for a friendly visit. I thought I'd stop by and see my boys, she said smoothly, glancing over my shoulder toward Luke. I stepped aside because I knew she'd walk in whether I let her or not. Luke's posture stiffened as soon as he saw her. Not fear, exactly, more like alertness. She crouched beside him, speaking softly in Spanish. I caught mi cielo again, and something about prepararnos, preparing ourselves. He gave a small nod, his eyes flicking briefly toward me before going back to her. I tried to keep my voice even. Margaret, can we talk? Her smile didn't falter. Of course, dear. We stepped into the kitchen, and I shut the door just enough to muffle the sounds from the living room. I know Luke is your cousin's child, I said, skipping any warm-up. And I know about the inheritance. For the first time, her expression shifted, just a hair, but enough. I see Daniel has been talking. Not Daniel, I said. I hired someone. I've seen the way you two interact. He knows you. He trusts you. And you've been using that to ensure his future, she interrupted smoothly. Do you think the state would have cared for him better? He'd have been lost in the system. With us, he'll inherit everything his father left for him. With us? I repeated. Or with you?" Her eyes hardened. "I'm not your enemy, Julia. But you've made yourself an obstacle." The words hung in the air, heavier than any threat I'd ever heard. "What does that mean?" I asked quietly. "It means," she said, leaning in just enough for me to catch the faint scent of her perfume, "that you should decide where you stand. Because if you stand in the wrong place, you won't be standing for long." She straightened, her smile snapping back into place as she returned to the living room. Luke was holding the whiteboard in his lap. Whatever he'd written, she erased before I could see. When she finally left, Luke sat very still, staring at the door. I knelt beside him. "What did she say?" I asked. He hesitated, then slowly wrote, "Que pronto vamos a irnos." That soon, we are going to leave. After Margaret's visit, the air in the house felt like it was pressing in on me. Soon, we are going to leave. The phrase replayed in my head all night. I couldn't stop picturing it, Margaret taking Luke's small hand, leading him out the door, slipping into a car I'd never see again. No legal fight, no warning, just gone. And Daniel. I had no doubt he'd let it happen. By the next morning, my fear had hardened into resolve. If they were making plans, I had to make mine faster. The first step was making sure Luke was never alone with Margaret again. I called her that day, telling her, politely, firmly, that I had rearranged my schedule and wouldn't need her help anymore. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to feel like she was calculating something, before she replied with a silky, "Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best." The second step was reaching out to the PI. "I need to know if there's any way she can take him without my consent," I told him. "She'd need legal grounds," he said. "But with Daniel involved in her prior guardianship paperwork, if you're not careful, she could spin it as you being unfit or obstructing family rights." "What do I do?" I asked. "Document everything. And if you think they'll move soon, be ready to disappear before they do." Disappear. The word felt unreal, but the more I turned it over, the more it started to make sense. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I sat in the dim glow of my laptop looking up safe houses and emergency custody filings. I copied every scrap of evidence, nanny cam clips, screenshots, the PI's reports, onto 2 flash drives. One went into my purse. The other, I hid in Luke's backpack under the lining, just in case. The next day, I picked him up early from school. We went to the park like nothing was wrong, but my heart was pounding. While he climbed the jungle gym, I kept scanning the parking lot, half expecting Margaret's car to pull up. When we got home, there was an envelope taped to the front door. No name, no address, just my first name written in looping cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature. Just one sentence in Spanish, "Mañana será más fácil." Tomorrow will be easier. I didn't need a translation. They were planning to take him tomorrow. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing Luke's face in my mind, his small, serious eyes, the way he'd looked at me when he asked if he could trust me. Tomorrow will be easier. I knew what it meant. I didn't need the PI to confirm it, and I didn't need to hear Margaret's voice to know she'd written it. At 5 a.m., I was already moving. I packed one suitcase for me and one small duffel for Luke. Essentials only: clothes, toiletries, the flash drive with every piece of evidence, Luke's favorite dinosaur, and the crocheted blanket from Margaret, which I intended to burn when we were safe. By 6, I had called a cab under a false name, telling them to pick us up 2 blocks away. Luke didn't ask questions as we walked through the quiet streets, he just kept his hand in mine, sneakers scuffing the pavement. When we got into the car, he glanced back toward our house once, then looked forward and didn't look back again. The PI had arranged a safe place for us, an apartment under a friend's name 3 towns over. It wasn't much, 1 bedroom, peeling wallpaper, the faint smell of old paint. But the locks were solid, and it was far from anyone who knew us. I called the PI from a burner phone. "We're out," I told him. "Now make sure they can't find us." He promised he would, and for the first time in weeks, I believed someone. 2 days later, he called with an update. Margaret had shown up at Luke's school with Daniel, trying to check him out early. The principal refused, citing my written authorization. By the time they realized we'd moved, they were already under investigation, thanks to the packet of evidence the PI had sent to the authorities. The inheritance? Turns out it was real. But now it would be tied up in court for years, and with the custody situation under scrutiny, neither Margaret nor Daniel would be able to touch it. Luke's future was safe, for now. We settled into our new routine slowly. Luke started humming again, more often now. Sometimes he'd write on the whiteboard in both English and Spanish, teaching me words I didn't know. One night, while we were eating macaroni on the couch, he wrote, "Gracias." I took the marker and wrote back, "Siempre." Always. Looking back, I realized this whole nightmare wasn't just about betrayal, it was about finding out exactly what I was capable of when someone I loved needed protecting. And if Margaret or Daniel ever tried to find us again, they'd learn that I'm not the same person who let them walk all over her. I'm someone who knows how to disappear, how to fight, and how to win. Because Luke wasn't the only one who escaped that house.